The advertisement did not mention that the boy had not spoken to another human being in 14 months. Neither did it mention that the last governess had lasted 4 days before requesting her trunk be brought down. It said only, "A governess is required for a single pupil at Crestwood Hall, Derbyshire. The household is small. Discretion is expected. Apply to Mr. Reeves, solicitor, London. No name, no age." No explanation for why a position in a great house had gone unanswered long enough to be advertised twice. Margaret Hale had answered it anyway. She had come from Northumberland with a trunk, 2 letters of reference, and the composure of a woman who has learned, through specific losses she does not name in company, that the world does not adjust itself to accommodate grief. You adjusted instead. You folded yourself into the shape required and you kept moving. She arrived on a Tuesday in October. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dowd, met her at the servants' entrance with the expression of a woman who had sized up new arrivals before and found the exercises increasingly unrewarding. She discovered the truth on her 3rd morning. Mrs. Dowd led her down a corridor she had not yet been shown and stopped outside a door and opened it without knocking, which told Margaret something about how the room's occupant had been taught to regard his own privacy. The room beyond was large and well lit and almost entirely silent. A boy sat at the window with his back to the room, his hands moving in the air before him, signing to no one she could see, or perhaps to himself, or perhaps to something in the middle distance beyond the glass that only he had learned to read. She stood in the doorway. The boy did not turn. He could not hear her. This was what Mrs. Dowd said, standing beside her in the tone of a woman delivering a message she was paid to deliver and had delivered before and had decided, somewhere along the way, to deliver without inflection, because inflection required feeling and feeling had not been asked for. The young master does not hear. He does not speak. He is not, a pause, brief, the kind where a word is being exchanged for a less damaging one. He is not as other boys. His Grace asks only that you keep him occupied, that you maintain order, that you do not trouble the household with unnecessary concerns. She smoothed her apron. His Grace does not come to this wing. Margaret looked at the boy at the window. He had gone still, not the stillness of rest, the particular stillness of a person who has learned that the world announces itself in vibrations and pressure and changes in light, who has learned to read these the way other people read faces, and who had felt, through the floor or the air or some sense she could not name, that someone was standing in his doorway. His shoulders had risen slightly. He was waiting for the sound of footsteps leaving. She understood this with a certainty that arrived not from reasoning but from recognition, because she had watched her brother William hold himself this same way at dinner tables and in drawing rooms for 18 years, waiting for the conversation to move past him without requiring him to pretend he had been part of it. William had not been deaf. He had simply been the kind of quiet the world mistakes for emptiness, and the world had made that mistake reliably and often, and Margaret had spent 18 years correcting it in small, insufficient ways, and then he had died, and there was no one left who needed the correction made, and she had come to Crestwood Hall with her trunk and her references and a grief she had converted, through long practice, into usefulness. She did not leave. She stepped into the room, moved deliberately around into his field of vision, and stopped at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to be unthreatening. She waited. He turned. His face moved quickly into an expression she would come to know over the weeks that followed, the careful, assembled neutrality of a boy who had learned that new faces preceded disappointment and had decided to meet them from behind a composure that asked nothing and expected nothing, and therefore could not be diminished by whatever came next. She raised her hand. Not a wave, not a greeting performed for the benefit of anyone watching, just a hand, open, offered at the level of her heart. Something moved in his face. It came and went too quickly for her to name. She had seen it before, that movement. She knew what it was. It was the involuntary response of a person who has been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting, who has been waiting so long that when it appears, they cannot immediately trust it. She took the notebook from her pocket. She wrote, "My name is Margaret. What is yours?" She held it up. He read it. She watched his eyes move across the words with the focus of someone for whom written language is not auxiliary but primary, the realist form of communication available to him in a world that communicated in ways he could not access. Then he looked at her. Then he reached out and took the notebook and the pencil and wrote one word, "James." She smiled. A real one. The kind that arrives before you can shape it into something more appropriate. He looked at the smile. He looked at it for a moment with that same evaluating stillness. Then he turned back to the window. But he did not give the notebook back. He held it in his lap, loosely, with the particular casualness of someone establishing ownership without wishing to appear to do so. She sat down on the floor, not on the chair. On the floor, where he could see her clearly without turning, and where she was below him, and therefore not a person who required management. He looked at her on the floor. A line appeared between his brows, not displeasure, something more like recalibration. This was not what people did. She picked up the book she had brought and opened it and read. After a while he turned back to the window. After a while longer he began signing to himself again, quietly, privately, the way a person hums when they have forgotten they are not alone. She stayed for an hour. She came back the next morning and the morning after that. The Duke of Crestwood she did not see for 3 weeks. This was, she understood gradually by design. Crestwood Hall was a large house that had arranged itself, over years, into a geography of avoidance. The Upper East Wing where James lived, and where Margaret now spent her mornings, existed in almost complete separation from the rooms the Duke occupied below. They shared a dining room in theory. In practice, Mrs. Dowd brought Margaret's meals to a small sitting room off the corridor, and the Duke, she was told, took his in the study. She did not ask why. She had been told not to trouble the household with unnecessary concerns, and she was learning the precise shape of what that instruction covered, which was extensive. She was also learning James. They built their vocabulary the way you build anything when you have no existing structure to borrow from, carefully, by trial and by agreement, testing each new sign the way you test ice before trusting weight to it. She had learned to sign once before, a long time ago, on a different road, and she found that the grammar of it came back to her body faster than she expected, the way a physical skill returns, in the hands before the mind. Some of what she had learned before did not match what James had invented for himself, and these divergences became their first real conversations, the places where the notebook gave way to the negotiated space of two people finding what they shared. She learned that he was 13, that he had been deaf since the age of 4, a fever taking his hearing in a single week the way fever takes things, without negotiation and without return, that he had been at Crestwood for 3 years, that before Crestwood there had been a school in Yorkshire which he would not sign about directly, but which appeared in his body when she came too close to the subject, a particular tightening across his shoulders that she recognized as the posture of a person who has learned to make themselves smaller in anticipation of something that never entirely stopped arriving. She did not press him on Yorkshire. She filed it alongside the question of the Duke's 11 months, and the 4 governesses in 3 years, and the advertisement placed twice, and she held all of it together and let it be a question that would answer itself when the time came. She learned that he drew. She had suspected it from the bird traced in the condensation on his window glass that first morning, but the depth of it surprised her. He kept sketchbooks under the window seat, 4 of them, covered in brown paper and filled from first page to last with drawings that made her sit on the floor with her back against the wall and turn pages in silence for a long time. Birds, primarily. Every species she recognized, and a great many she did not, drawn with the precision of someone who had spent hundreds of hours in observation, who had watched the way a wing folded and a head tilted with the absolute attention available only to a person who cannot fill silence with sound, and has therefore learned to fill it with looking. He had also drawn the view from his window in every season, 4 times, the same rectangle of garden and sky, dated in the corner in a small careful hand. Autumn to winter to spring to summer, and back to autumn again. 4 seasons of the same window. She looked at the 4 drawings together and thought about what it meant to mark time that way, not in events or occasions, but in the slow change of light through glass, in the only view available to you. One page near the back of the 3rd sketchbook stopped her, a figure at a gate. Drawn from above, from the angle of a 2nd-floor window, a man standing at the low gate in the south hedge with his hands at his sides. The drawing had no date. It had been done and then done again on the next page, slightly different, and again on the page after that. The same figure, the same gait, the same posture of a man standing at a distance and not crossing it. She did not ask James about it. She closed the sketchbook and put it back and looked at the window and felt the anger arrive, quietly, the way it had been arriving in increments for 2 weeks. Not hot anger, the cold, considered kind that settles in and does not leave because it has nowhere yet to go. She told him, in the notebook, that the drawings were extraordinary. He read the word and looked at her and wrote, "The last one said I wasted too much time on them." She took the notebook. She crossed out the last governess's opinion with a single clean line. She wrote beneath it, "She was wrong." He held the notebook against his chest for a moment, without reading it again. He did not need to read it again. He looked at the window and she watched the slow arrival of something in his face, not quite belief, the stage before belief, the careful preliminary testing of whether a thing might be allowed to be true. She thought about the 4 governesses. She thought about the advertisement placed twice. She thought about what it meant that a boy of 13 had been through 4 adults in 3 years, each one sent by the same man who had arranged the same arrangement, and she thought about what James had learned from that repetition, what he had been taught, without anyone intending to teach it, about his own capacity to be endured. The anger settled in her chest and she kept it there and kept moving. She showed none of it. She had very little power in this house, and anger without power is simply noise, and she had not come all this way to make noise. She went to Mrs. Dowd instead and asked, practically, whether James might use the library for his education. Mrs. Dowd looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been maintaining an arrangement for a long time and had not been asked questions about it, and was uncertain whether questions constituted the unnecessary concerns she had been instructed to discourage. "I will ask His Grace," she said. The answer came back the following morning, the library, between 10 and 12 when His Grace was riding. She took James the following Tuesday. She had written it in the notebook the evening before, and he had read the word library and looked up at her with an expression that was not quite hope, because he had learned to handle hope the way you handle something that has burned you, at a distance and with care. But it was close enough to hope that she had to look at the window for a moment. He had not been to the library in a year. She did not ask who had last taken him. He went straight to the natural history section and ran his hands along the spines and pulled out 3 volumes on British birds before she had settled into a chair. He sat on the floor where she had sat, and she thought she had given him something without knowing it, the small permission of the posture, the instruction that some spaces could be occupied without formality. He opened the first volume and was gone entirely, absorbed in the way only he could be absorbed, the way that made the room around him irrelevant. She watched him and thought about the word discretion in the advertisement, and what it had been arranged to cover. She was still thinking about it when the library door opened. The Duke of Crestwood was taller than she had assembled from the solicitor's correspondence, and younger than his title implied. Not yet 30, with a face that held itself still in the way faces do when stillness has been practiced long enough to become the resting state. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the boy on the floor, surrounded by open books. He had prepared himself, she thought, for some version of this encounter. He had not prepared himself adequately. She stood, reflects the standing, the folded hands, the posture. She had been standing up for men in doorways since she was 18, and she did it without deciding to, and disliked herself briefly for it. He said quietly, so the boy would not feel the vibration. "I was not told you would be using the library today, Mrs. Dowd gave permission," Margaret said. A pause that was not quite silence, of course. He looked at James again. James had not looked up. He was copying a drawing of a marsh harrier into his sketchbook with the focused intensity that made the surrounding world irrelevant. And he had not felt the disturbance of his brother's presence, or if he had learned not to turn toward it. His brother. She had confirmed this 3 days earlier through the gardener who had been at Crestwood since before James was born and who had not been schooled in discretion with sufficient thoroughness. She had been carrying it for 3 days alongside everything else, and had said nothing because she had not yet found the place to put it down. "He draws," the Duke said. "Not a question, a discovery. The slightly dazed quality of a man encountering a fact he should have known." "Exceptionally," Margaret said. "He has filled 4 sketchbooks since the spring. I believe he works in the evenings as well." The Duke looked at her then, fully, for the first time. She met his gaze and held it and said nothing further, and let the sentence stand in the room between them and do its work. "I was not aware," he said. "No," she said, "I imagined you were not." She watched him receive it. Not anger in his expression, something more complicated than anger. The look of a man encountering an accounting he had been avoiding and finding it more precise than he had feared. He looked at James once more. A long look, the kind that has weight in it. Then he said, "I will leave you to it," and he left, and the door closed behind him, and James looked up at the change in the room and signed the question she now understood without needing the notebook. "Someone came in," she wrote. "They have gone." He nodded and returned to the Marsh Harrier. She sat back down. Her hands in her lap were not entirely steady. She found Mrs. Dowd that afternoon. She had not intended the conversation to become what it became. She had intended a practical question about mealtimes, a permitted question, a safe one. But she asked it and Mrs. Dowd answered it, and then, in the pause that followed, something shifted in the housekeeper's face. "Not much. Enough," Mrs. Dowd said to the window rather than to Margaret. "He was not always like this, His Grace. When the boy first came home from Yorkshire, he came upstairs every day, twice some days. He was learning the signs then, had a tutor come from London to teach him." She paused. "Then one morning he came up and the boy would not look at him, just sat at the window and would not turn. His Grace stood in the room for a long time. Then he came back downstairs, and that was the last time for many months." Margaret waited. "He blamed himself," Mrs. Dowd said. "He has never said so, he will not say so. But I have been in this house since he was 7 years old, and I know what his face does when he is punishing himself, and he has been wearing that face for 3 years. She smoothed her apron and became again the woman who delivered messages without inflection. But Margaret had seen the other woman briefly, the one underneath the apron, and she did not forget her. She went upstairs. She sat on the floor of the east room and watched James draw until the light failed, and thought about a boy who had come home from a place that had taken something from him and had sat at a window and had not turned, and about a man who had stood in that room for a long time and had come back downstairs and had not gone up again, and about the terrible way that two people can be equally lost in the same house and never find each other because finding each other requires someone to move first, and neither of them has been able to make themselves do it. She told herself she was not yet ready to be the person who moved first. She did not entirely believe it. The second encounter with the Duke happened 4 days later in the garden. She had started taking James outside in the afternoons, partly for the light, and partly because she had decided, without authorization from anyone, that a boy who drew birds with that precision deserved to see them in something other than books. They went to the south lawn, enclosed and away from the main drive, and James would settle on the ground with his sketchbook, and she would sit nearby, and they would share the particular silence that had become the most honest part of her day. The Duke appeared at the gate in the south hedge. He did not open it. He stood with his hand on the latch and watched, and Margaret, who had positioned herself so she could see the garden's entrance, watched him watch without letting him know she did. A thrush had settled on the low stone wall, perhaps 10 feet from where James sat. James was drawing it with the absolute stillness he brought to living subjects, barely breathing, pencil moving in small certain strokes, and the thrush, either indifferent to or somehow at ease with his particular quality of stillness, stayed on the wall for nearly 10 minutes. The Duke stood at the gate for all 10 of them. Still, in the way she was beginning to recognize as his, the stillness of a man who has learned to observe from a distance, because distance is the only position from which he has allowed himself to watch. When the thrush finally lifted and was gone, James exhaled and looked at the drawing and turned it to show Margaret with the expression that was not quite a smile, quieter than a smile. That meant he was satisfied. She signed, "Perfect." The delay before his face changed was shorter than it used to be. She had learned to measure the delay as trust, as the accumulated evidence of 6 weeks of mornings that had slowly shifted the odds in favor of believing. He allowed the word to land. He looked at the drawing again with new eyes, seeing it slightly differently now that someone else had seen it. She looked up. The Duke was still at the gate. He was watching her hands. She met his eyes across the lawn and held them for a moment, steady and direct, and then looked back at James, who was already beginning a second drawing from memory, reconstructing the thrush in flight from what his eye had kept. She heard the gate latch close quietly behind her. That evening Mrs. Dowd appeared in the sitting-room doorway. "His Grace would like to speak with you," she said. "Tomorrow morning." Dusty. Margaret set down her fork. She went upstairs to James afterward and wrote, "You are not in any trouble. I want you to know that." He read it and wrote back, without hesitation, I know, you would have told me. She held the notebook and looked at that sentence for a long moment, the simple, unguarded certainty of it. He had not written it as a hope. He had written it as a fact, something he had tested and found reliable. And the difference between those two things, between hoping someone will tell you and knowing they will, was not a small difference. It was the distance between isolation and something else entirely. Yes, she wrote, I would have. She went to the study the next morning at 9. The Duke was standing at the window with a cup of coffee he had not drunk. He turned when she entered and gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until she had sat before sitting himself. She noticed this. It was a small thing, and he had done it without deliberation, which made it more telling than if he had thought about it. He looked at his desk. He looked at her. He said, "How is he?" Not the performance of a question. The actual question, asked in the voice of a man who has not permitted himself to ask it in a long time, and is uncertain whether he has the right to it now. She said, "He is intelligent, gifted in ways that have not been properly recognized. He is also very accustomed to being left alone." The Duke was quiet. Then, the previous governesses. "I am not concerned with the previous governesses," Margaret said. "I am concerned with him." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man deciding how much honesty he was prepared for. She looked back and said nothing further and let him decide. He said at last, "He was not always here. There was a school in Yorkshire. I was told it was the best available, that it would give him structure, occupation." He stopped at the next phrase, visibly, in the way a person stops when they hear themselves about to repeat words that were given to them by someone else, and that they accepted without examination, that it was the best option for a boy like him. He looked at the desk. "I was 22, he said. My father had died the previous year. There was the estate, the title, everything that arrives at once when you are not prepared for any of it. James was 10. I did not know what to do with a deaf boy of 10, and I had no one around me who did either. Or if they did, they said nothing." He paused. "I visited once in the first year. I was told he was adjusting. I believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative, and I was 22 and already exhausted, and I chose the easier thing." He was quiet for a moment. In the second year there was a report from the school. The word they used was manageable. They offered it as a reassurance. He looked up briefly, then back at the desk. "When I went to fetch him, the room he was in had no books. There was no sketchbook. The window faced a wall. He was sitting in a chair, and he did not turn when I came in, and I stood behind him for a long time saying his name, which he could not hear, because I had not learned how to say his name in any language he could understand." He stopped. The room held the silence of that sentence. "I brought him home," he said. "I put him in the East Wing. I arranged tutors. I arranged everything I could think to arrange." He looked at his hands briefly and then away from them. "I told myself he needed quiet, stability, that the worst thing I could do was disturb whatever recovery he was making. The tutors sent reports. He was eating, he was drawing again. I told myself that was enough. I told myself I would go up when he was better." He looked at her. "He was waiting for me to come up," he said, and the quietness of it was worse than if he had raised his voice. "And I did not go, because every time I stood at the bottom of that staircase I saw the room in Yorkshire, the window facing a wall. No sketchbook. I knew I had put him there. I knew it was my decision. And I could not go upstairs and look at what I had made of him. It was easier, considerably easier, to send tutors and receive reports and tell myself that an arrangement was the same thing as a presence." The coffee on the desk had gone cold. Outside the study window the October grounds lay still and grey and indifferent. Margaret said, "I want to tell you something about the sketchbooks." He waited. "He has drawn the view from his window in every season," she said. 4 times, dated in the corner. The same view, the same window, marked by the changing of light because it was the only way he had to mark time passing. She paused. "He has drawn every bird on the south lawn, and near the back of the 3rd book, drawn 3 times on consecutive pages, there is a figure at the south gate. A man standing at the gate with his hands at his sides, drawn from the angle of a 2nd-floor window. She let that remain in the room between them. "He knew you were there," she said. "Every time you stood at that gate, he was watching. He kept you in the only archive available to him, with the same attention he gives to the things he loves most. And I need you to understand that before you go upstairs, because I think you have been carrying a particular fear about what you will find when you do. And I think that fear has been wrong." The Duke had gone very still. She said, "He is not recovering, he recovered. Some time ago, he has been waiting." He stood. He did not say anything. He walked to the door of the study and opened it, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Steady, neither rushed nor reluctant, the footsteps of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can find a reason not to. She waited a moment. Then she followed him as far as the landing and sat down on the top stair and folded her hands in her lap and waited. The house was very quiet. The particular quiet of a held breath, of something that has been suspended for a long time and is now at last being allowed to fall. She heard a door open, then nothing for a long time. Then a sound she could not name and did not try to, a sound that belonged to a room she was not in and to two people who did not need a witness. She sat on the stair until the light in the corridor shifted. When the Duke came out of the east room, he did not see her immediately. He stood in the corridor with one hand still on the doorframe and his head slightly bowed. He had been weeping. She could see it clearly in the quality of his stillness, and she looked at it directly and did not offer him the dignity of pretending she had not, because she thought he had been given the dignity of not being seen in exchange for this, for 11 months of not being seen, and she thought he had had enough of that particular dignity. He saw her on the stair, she held his gaze. He crossed the corridor and sat down beside her, on the stair where she was, not in the study, not across a desk. Here, on the same level, in the same narrow space, which was its own kind of statement, and she received it as such. He showed me the sketchbooks. All four? All four. He looked at his own hands in his lap. He has drawn me. At the gate. 3 times. He showed me as though he were showing me something I had not known about myself. Something he had kept safe until I was ready to receive it. She thought about the notebook held against a chest, about the 4 seasons of the same window, about a boy who had been taught by repetition that people left, and who had kept drawing them anyway, kept them in books under a window seat, kept them safe. He does not hate you, she said. I want you to hear that plainly. He is angry, the way a person is angry when they have been lonely for a long time without being permitted to say so. But beneath the anger there is something else entirely, and the drawings say what it is more clearly than I can. The Duke looked at the stair beneath his feet. There is something else I want to say to you, she said, and I want to say it plainly, because I have said everything else in this house plainly, and I will not stop now. He looked at her. The 4 governesses, she said. I have thought about them for weeks. I believe I understand why they left. Not because James was difficult. He is not difficult. Because a woman engaged to care for a child, and then kept from that child by an arrangement that required her participation in his loneliness, would find, in time, that she could not sustain the contradiction. They cared for him. That was the problem. Women who did not care would have stayed indefinitely. The ones who left because they were capable of more than what you hired them to do, and they could not continue to pretend otherwise. She paused. They did not leave because of James. They left because of you, because what you arranged was not care. It was management. And there is a difference, and every woman you employed knew the difference, and eventually each of them could not unknow it. She had said more than she had planned. She had said exactly what she meant. The Duke was quiet for a long time. You are still here, he said. Yes, she said, because I believe you are capable of more than management. I did not believe it when I arrived. I have been revising that opinion for 4 weeks. I am telling you, because you should know that the revision is ongoing and is not yet finished, and the work of finishing it belongs to you. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the managed stillness. Something underneath the stillness, exposed now, uncertain in the way that genuine things are uncertain when they have been kept covered for a long time and are suddenly in the light. Will you teach me, he said, what you and James have built between you? I want to learn it. She considered him. It will take time, she said. You will fail at it repeatedly, and he will know when you are frustrated, and he will conclude the frustration is about him, unless you have learned enough to tell him clearly that it is about the language. That is harder than it sounds. You will have to be in the East Wing every day, not as a duty. He knows the difference between a person who comes because they have decided to come, and a person who comes because they have put it on a list, and he has had enough of lists. Every day, the Duke said. Yes, she stood, she smoothed her dress. She looked down at him on the stair, the Duke of Crestwood in his own house, with his hands loose between his knees and his face open, in a way it had not been open since she arrived, and she thought about the advertisement and the word discretion, and everything that single careful word had been arranged to conceal. Tomorrow morning, she said, 9 o'clock, Bring nothing. Leave the door open. She went downstairs. Behind her, after a moment, she heard him stand and go back to the east room, and the sound of the door opening and remaining open, as she had asked, without yet knowing she would ask it. The lessons began the next morning. They were clumsy and slow, and James did not pretend otherwise. He was not unkind about the clumsiness, but he was precise about it in the way that a person is precise when they have been a student for 3 years, and know exactly what it looks like when someone is trying, versus when someone is performing trying. The Duke was genuinely trying. James could see this. It made him patient in a way that cost him nothing, because patience freely given is not the same expenditure as patience extorted. On the third morning, the Duke produced a sign for Sparrow that bore no resemblance to a sparrow, or to any living creature Margaret could identify, and James looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Margaret, and then pressed his hand over his mouth, his shoulders convulsing silently. The Duke looked at his brother, laughing at him, and said nothing, and held out his hands and waited to be corrected. James took his hands and repositioned the fingers with the careful deliberateness of a teacher who understands that the hands have to feel the right shape before the mind can remember it. Margaret sat in the corner with the notebook and watched a man allow his 13-year-old brother to correct his hands, and tried not to let what she felt about it show on her face. She did not entirely succeed, James saw. He looked at her and signed, small and quick, the sign they had built in the second week for something that was true but that you were not ready to say out loud yet. She looked back at him steadily and signed nothing, and he pressed his lips together and returned to the Sparrow with great dignity. The winter came in slowly, and the lessons continued, and the house began, incrementally, to change its shape. Not all at once. The way water changes stone, without announcement, through repetition and time. James began coming downstairs. First to the library, then to dinner, tentatively at first, with the careful posture of someone who has been disappointed often enough to approach good things sideways. The Duke signed to him across the dinner table, imperfectly, with occasional recourse to Margaret for assistance, and James signed back with the fluency of someone in their first language, talking to someone in their second, making allowances without condescension. Mrs. Dowd stood in the doorway of the dining room one evening in December and watched them, and then turned away before anyone could see her see it. Margaret saw anyway. She said nothing. Some things do not need to be named to be acknowledged. In November, on an evening when the first frost had come and the grounds were silver and still, Margaret went to her room after James had gone to bed and stood in front of the unpacked trunk in the corner and looked at it for a long time. She had been living out of it since October, taking what she needed each morning and replacing it each evening, maintaining without acknowledging it the posture of someone who had not yet decided to stay. She unpacked it. She did not make a ceremony of it. She folded everything into the drawers and hung the 2 dresses she had kept rolled at the bottom. And when she was done, the trunk was empty and the room looked, for the first time, like somewhere she lived rather than somewhere she was passing through. She did not call it a decision. It was simply the acknowledgement of one already made. The Duke found her in the library in February. She was reading by the fire, late, after the household had gone to bed. He came in and stopped when he saw her, and she looked up. He said, "May I sit? It is not my library," she said. He sat across from her. He looked at the fire for a moment in the way that a person looks at something neutral while arranging something else. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what to say to you for some time, and I have not found the correct approach, so I am going to say it without one." She closed her book on her finger. He said, "I know what this house was when you arrived. I know what you found here and what you did with it, which was to convert what should have been accusation into work, and then to do the work without requiring anything of me except that I eventually become capable of doing it with you. That is not a small thing. I am aware that it is not a small thing." He looked at the fire. "I am not going to ask you anything tonight," he said. "I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I am not asking because I know what I am and I know what you are, and I know that asking from inside that distance is a particular kind of unfairness, even when it does not intend to be. What I am doing tonight is telling you something I have not told another person, which is that this house is different because you are in it. James is different, I am different, and I am aware of who made that difference, and I am aware that she was not required to, and she did it anyway, and I did not want to let that go another month without saying so plainly." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She let what he had said be what it was without immediately converting it into something manageable. She said, "I unpacked my trunk in November." He was quiet. She said, "I did not make a decision about it. I simply unpacked it, and I have left it unpacked since, and I think we both understand what that means, and I am not going to explain it further than that." He said, "No. I understand it." She said, "I know what question you are not asking tonight." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know what my answer will be when you ask it." The fire had burned low. Outside the library windows, the February grounds lay under frost, still and indifferent, the way the world is always indifferent to what people are quietly deciding inside lit rooms, which is not a reason not to decide. She opened her book. He did not leave. They sat by the fire until it went out, and the room was lit only by moonlight through the tall windows. Two people sitting in the comfortable dark of those who have stopped pretending that the distance between them is the distance they intend to maintain, he asked in April. On the south lawn, on an afternoon balanced between the last of winter and the first of spring, cold still, but with a light that had changed quality, that had begun to mean something other than endurance. James was on the ground with his sketchbook. 3 lapwings had appeared on the lawn the previous week, and had, in James's firm opinion, significantly improved the property. He was drawing them with the total absorption that blocked out everything else, the absorption that Margaret had come to regard as one of the finest things she had ever been permitted to watch. The Duke came and stood beside her. He watched his brother draw for a while. Then he turned and asked her, plainly, without arrangement, in the voice of a man who had done the preliminary work, and was now simply speaking. She said yes, not quickly, not easily. The yes of a woman who had done the arithmetic honestly, and found that the answer remained yes despite the arithmetic, and who understood that the remaining despite was the truest thing about it. The yes of a woman who had unpacked a trunk in November without calling it a decision, and had been living, since then, inside the shape of what it was. James looked up. He had felt the change in the air between them, the shift in the particular quality of how two people stand next to each other when something has just been settled. He looked at Margaret. He looked at his brother. He looked at their faces for a long time with the attention he gave to the things he drew, the attention that saw proportion and angle and the exact truth of what was in front of him. He signed, finally. The Duke produced the sign they had built in the early weeks for helpless in the face of something that cannot be argued with. James made it back at him with considerable feeling, and then looked at the lapwings, and then looked at the 2 people beside him, and opened to a new page in his sketchbook, and began drawing Margaret instead, with the same focused stillness he brought to living things, the same quality of looking that preserved what was true rather than what was convenient. He had been drawing her since October. She did not know this yet. He showed her the drawing first. She looked at it and then looked at him, and he reached under the edge of his jacket and produced a 5th sketchbook, smaller than the others, kept separately. She opened it. October, November, December, January, February. Margaret at the window, Margaret on the floor. Margaret with the notebook. Margaret in the library doorway, seen from the corridor, the light from inside making a shape around her. Margaret at the garden gate, standing the way the Duke had stood at the gate, watching something beyond the frame of the drawing. She turned pages slowly. She did not speak. He had been watching her the way he watched the birds, with the full weight of his attention, with the intention of keeping what he saw, of making it permanent in the only way available to him, so that if she left as people left, he would still have what he had seen of her. She closed the book and held it and looked at the lawn for a long time, the Duke had seen. He reached across, not for the book, but for her hand, and took it the way you take something you intend to keep and have thought about how to hold. She let him. She held on. James looked at the lapwings and looked at the 2 people beside him and made the sign he had offered her on the very first morning, when she had stood in his field of vision and held out her hand, and he had decided, after a long and careful assessment, that she was unlikely to withdraw it. A hand held open, fingers loose, at the level of the heart. Good, safe, enough. She made it back to him. Then to the Duke, who returned it without hesitation and without error, with the whole of his hands and none of the performance that had once been the whole of his face. The school opened the following year. It was housed in the converted east wing of Crestwood Hall, which had been too large for one boy alone and was exactly the right size for 14. James sat in the front row on the first morning, with the posture of someone who had arrived somewhere they had been moving toward without knowing it. The two tutors, both deaf, settled the room by signing something worth watching, which was the only way to settle a room of deaf children and the correct way to start. James taught drawing. He had decided this in February and had not moved from the decision since, and there was no one at Crestwood Hall with any interest in moving him. The school needed a name. This had been the one thing Margaret asked for in April before she said yes to anything else. She had asked that James choose it, because the things built for people matter less than the things built with them, and because James had been the beginning of all of it, and she thought he should know that. He thought about it for a month. On a Tuesday evening in May, he wrote the name in the notebook and showed it to his brother first, and then to Margaret. She read it. She looked at him. She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. He had named it for both of them. For William and for Edmund, for the brother she had lost, and the brother the Duke had very nearly lost in a different way. A name that held both losses in the same space, and said something true about what loss, when you refuse to let it be only loss, can sometimes make of you. The notebook sat open on the table. The Duke read it and was still for a long time, not the managed stillness. The real kind, the kind that comes when something has arrived that is larger than the space you had prepared for it. He signed to his brother. "It is exactly right." James signed back. "I know." Outside the window, the May grounds were completing themselves in the indifferent, total way of things that have never doubted their own arrival, moving through the gardens of Crestwood Hall with the unhurried commitment of a season that knows precisely what it is doing and requires no one's permission to do it. Inside, around a table with a notebook and a name written in it, 3 people sat in the particular quiet of those who have built something together and are now, for a moment, simply present in what they have built, before the next thing begins. Margaret looked at the name on the page. She looked at the boy who had written it, her student, her reader, the keeper of the 5th sketchbook, the one who had drawn her standing at a gate watching something she could not yet see. She thought he had probably known, even then, what she was looking toward. She thought he had been right. If this story stayed with you, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from. Leave it in the comments. We have people watching from places that stop me every time I read them, and every location still does. And if this one moved you, please share it with someone who might need it today. These stories travel by hand, one person to the next, and there are corners of the world this one has not reached yet. Help me send it there.